Senator from Utah.
I ask unanimous consent to suspend the quorum call.
Without objection.
Mr. President, it wasn't too long ago when Republicans made a promise to ourselves and to the American people that before we sent another dollar, another dime, another nickel, another penny to Ukraine, we'd ensure that our own house was in order, that our own country was secure, that our own border was secure, that we would pass a real border security measure. And yet here we are, months later, preparing to dispatch nearly $100 billion. If you say it slowly, you sound a little bit like Dr. Evil in the original Austin Powers movie. $100 billion to foreign countries, while the security of our own homeland languishes. House Republicans have broken their promise, and at least a critical mass of them, under the direction of House Republican leadership, they've betrayed the American people because they've gone back completely on what we promised. Tonight, we're seeing the same movie played out on the Senate floor. Now, this occurs at a time when about 60% of Americans live paycheck to paycheck, and yet Congress continues to add to a national debt. It's about to blow past the $35 trillion mark. How then, Mr. President, can we justify this to the American people? As a Congress, are we really more concerned with the borders of a foreign country, Ukraine, and with foreign wars around the world than we are with the safety and the security of the United States and its citizens? This bill tells the American people that the answer to that question is an unambiguous, resounding yes. Congress cares more about sending billions to wage endless war in foreign countries, cares more about this than saving our own country, especially at a time when we're being invaded, when we've seen an invasion of between 8 and 13 million people over the last few years alone. That's a big deal. Now, we're forgetting the wise caution left to us by our first president, the father of our country, George Washington, who warned against entangling our peace and our prosperity with the affairs of other nations. He said, why, quote, by interweaving our destiny with that of any part of Europe, entangle our peace and prosperity in the toils of European ambition, rivalship, interest, humor, or caprice, close quote. Indeed, it seems no price is too high. No weapon system is off limits. Our only strategy appears to be spend, 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 and then spend some more with little to no thought given to the consequences. It's the continuation of a lackluster approach to the Ukraine-Russia conflict, devoid of coherent strategy while allocating the vast majority of its funding to Europe and the Middle East, neglecting, of course, the looming threats from China and the warnings from great national policy experts like Elbridge Colby, who warn us time and time again that the same weapons that we're depleting, sending to other parts of the world, sending to Ukraine, are those that are in such dire need in Taiwan and elsewhere. The $13 billion in military aid to Israel is juxtaposed with the up to $9.1 billion in civilian aid going to Hamas. Now, some would say, you mean Gaza, and I say, no, I mean Hamas. You cannot send this aid, even if it's labeled as humanitarian or for some other noble-sounding purpose. If you send it to Gaza, it is aid to Hamas. Hamas terrorists, these are the same terrorists who massacred, who butchered, who savagely mutilated innocent men, women, and children in Israel just a few months ago in October. The architects of this bill undermined their own goal to secure stability and peace in the region. And so I've come to the floor in an attempt to soften the blow to the American people. And to that end, Mr. President, I'd like to call up Lee Amendment number 1902 for consideration. My amendment would require Ukraine to repay the money loaned to it and that the funds repaid be used to secure our border. If Congress is so determined to send taxpayer money abroad, then the repayment of this loan should not be waivable and must be used to secure our border. Now, it's sad that shoring up our border and protecting our own citizens has to come at the mercy of our debtors, but that is what this administration thinks of everyday Americans, that they don't deserve protection. We should be voting on H.R. 2, and we should be doing that today. We should be addressing the crisis at the border. Instead, we're focused on sending money to secure Ukraine's border, not our own. Now, Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent to set aside any pending amendments and motions in order to call up my motion to concur with amendment number 1902.
Is there objection?
Mr. President, I object.
Objection is heard.
Now, if the objection is that my proposal is somehow not germane, then I'll offer another amendment. I want to bring up Lee Amendment 1857 for consideration. It would ensure that the repayment of the loan Congress seems so determined to give Ukraine is exclusively used to pay down the U.S. national debt. This bill demands the American people dig deeper into their pockets, funding the salaries and pensions of Ukrainian officials and humanitarian efforts under the guise of a loan. The unsettling truth is that this loan can and almost certainly will be waived, possibly leaving Americans without any reimbursement. I think that's part of the plan, in fact. Makes it easier to swallow. Makes it look like something less than what it is. My amendment addresses this concern by prohibiting any cancellation of the debt owed by Ukraine and ensuring its repayments go directly to the U.S. national debt. By presenting this amendment, I aim to offer the American people the financial security and oversight this bill currently lacks, deliberately so, effectively serving as an insurance policy against irresponsible fiscal gambles half a world away. And so I ask unanimous consent to set aside any pending amendments and motions in order to call up my motion to concur with amendment number 1857.
Is there objection?
Mr. President, I object.
The objection is heard.
Next, I'm going to call up in a moment Lee Amendment number 1882 for consideration. If we're genuinely concerned about security, let's just start by securing our own citizens' personal information, securing it from foreign adversaries. My amendment would prohibit the sale, transfer, or sharing of American personal data to governments like China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran without explicit consent from the individual. Now, for weeks, proponents of the House-passed bill to force the sale of TikTok, legislation included in the package we're debating, have told us that this legislation is vital to protecting the security of Americans' data. The reality, however, is far more complicated. Indeed, forcing the sale of TikTok through that legislation won't itself secure the data of users. Instead, it'll simply allow another company to purchase TikTok and do with their users' data what they may. Only by changing the underlying law and preventing companies from handing over Americans' information to our adversaries can Congress secure the personal information of every American. And my amendment aims to do just that, rather than engage in a regulatory game of whack-a-mole, whereby we allow ourselves to be distracted by whatever company happens to be making headlines at the moment. My amendment would implement a comprehensive prohibition on any individual or company operating in the U.S. from selling, transferring, or sharing the data of an American citizen to the government of a foreign adversary without that individual's express consent. This is a serious solution to a serious problem. No company should profit by exposing the personal information of an American citizen to a hostile foreign power, whether that company is owned by a foreign national or by an American citizen. And to that end, I ask unanimous consent to set aside any pending amendments and motions in order to call up my motion to concur with amendment number 1882.
Is there objection?
Mr. President, I object.
Objection is noted.
This really is too bad. These are some really good amendments, and Apparently, we're not allowed to have those. We're just allowed to, sing off of whatever hymnal they happen to hand us that's been pre-blessed by the law firm of Schumer, McConnell, Johnson, and Jeffries. And that's unfortunate. Next, I want to call up Lee Amendment 1860 for consideration, which proposes to strike all emergency spending designations from the bill. We cannot continue to spend under the guise of an emergency, especially when an actual emergency, a real-life, present-tense, presently located emergency involving the security of our own nation's national border is not even being addressed in this bill. Not just that it's not being resolved, it's not even being addressed at all. This irresponsible practice has led to a ballooning national debt, now nearing $35 trillion. It'll soon blow past that. If this spending is necessary, it should be subject to the same budgetary constraints as all other government expenditures. This bill spends almost $100 billion, $100 billion we don't have, on top of the more than $100 billion Congress has already appropriated for the war in Ukraine over the last 2 years, in excess of $113 billion, if I'm not mistaken. We'll spend more money on interest payments on our national debt this year than on all base defense spending. And within a year, I believe we're likely to be spending well over $1 trillion a year just in interest on debt. If Congress believes it's worth spending $100 billion we don't have, Congress should be making sure that that sum of money will be fully offset or subject to appropriate budgetary enforcement. So my amendment would strike the emergency designations in this bill to subject this additional spending to the annual caps Congress agreed to last year, while simultaneously preventing the bill's budgetary effects from escaping proper enforcement. And so, Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent to set aside any pending amendments and motions in order to call up my motion to concur with Amendment number 1860.
Is there objection?
Mr. President, I object.
The objection is noted.
Mr. President, it's profoundly distressing, disappointing to say the least, that these common sense amendments have been so cavalierly objected to, that they've been met only with one-word objections. Although my amendment to strike the emergency designations, all of them, drew an objection pursuant to Section 314E of the Congressional Budget Act of 1974, I intend to raise a point of order against these same emergency designations for international disaster assistance and migration and refugee assistance for Gaza. We are, in the end, going to have to acknowledge that we're at a critical juncture, compelled to reevaluate our priorities as a nation and our responsibilities to the American people. Every decision we make must be weighted against the best interests of those we're sworn to serve, and not those of people abroad, but those who are right here at home. Waving the flag of another nation in Congress as you vote to send them tens of billions of dollars doesn't inspire confidence. It creates distrust. As legislators, we've failed in our duty if we don't heed the call to prioritize the American people first. And so, to all out there who find this distressing, to the distressed Americans, to the distressed carpenters, the distressed plumbers, the distressed poets, I'm sorry that we weren't able and willing to secure the border. We should have been able to do that. We made a promise, and we as Republicans shouldn't have deviated from that promise. Certainly not with the critical mass necessary to facilitate passage of this in the House, and then, before the night's finished, likely the Senate. Certainly not under the leadership of our own elected Republican leaders, who themselves had repeated this promise just not too many weeks ago, a promise that's now apparently a thing of the past that we're supposed to forget. This $95 billion aid package to foreign countries is a stark testament of the misguided priorities of our current congressional leadership, and a clear indication that we've let ourselves, and perhaps more critically, the American people, down. The situation demands a wake-up call to every member of this body. By failing to address the fundamental needs of our own people, the American people, in favor of international interests, we risk not only the prosperity, but also the security of our nation. And make no mistake, this isn't free. Although it can feel free to those of us who work in this hallowed chamber, it can feel free to us. It can feel as if we draw from an endless, unlimited well, but we don't. As we've seen to an acute degree over the last few years, every time we spend more money than we have, that comes at a cost. Sure, we borrow the money, and sure, the credit of the United States is still just good enough that it can feel like we have the capacity to just print our own money, which is essentially what we're doing. But every time we do that, every dollar earned by every hardworking American, every mom and dad, married or single, in this country just trying to put food on the table for their kids, suffers as they're having to shell out an additional $1,000 a month every single month just to live, just to put a roof over their head and keep food on the table. I agree with the assessment of Nobel laureate, famed economist Milton Friedman, who said that at any given moment, the true level of taxation in America can best be measured not by the top marginal tax rate or even the average effective tax rate, but instead by the overall level of government spending. This, he explained, perhaps referring to the odd combination of credit rating and the way our deficit spending works, that in effect, every year when we look at overall government spending, especially federal spending, that's the true cost of the federal government, because what we don't collect in taxes, we effectively print and thereby devalue every dollar that is earned by every American by degrees. Only unlike other expenses that people have, monthly bills that they receive or their annual tax return that they file, there's no billing moment attached to this. There's no price tag. You don't ever see the overall amount that you're spending in this, as you do at least once a year when you file your federal income tax return. No, it's very different with inflation. Each dollar is diminished bit by bit. The federal government is costly, and when it sends money abroad that we don't have to fund somebody else in fighting a war against somebody else, that costs money. Another thing we learn about these proxy wars is that in the United States of America, which has assembled the greatest military force the world has ever known, certainly the strongest military force that exists today, proxy wars that carry on for going on 2+ years now. We're in our 3rd year of this effort. They don't remain proxy wars forever. It becomes especially startling when the proxy war is being fought against a nuclear-armed adversary. That is not to say that we can never push back against any nuclear-armed adversary, but it does mean we should be darn careful when we do that. We should know exactly what our objective is, what it's going to take to secure the peace so that we don't have to fight that war. We don't avoid the profound risk to our own national security simply by funneling money through a proxy. Whether that proxy is a great steward of the funds, weapons, and resources that we send, or not. Whether that country happens to be one that's proven impervious to fraud, corruption, money laundering, and grift, or not. We should be concerned about what happens to that money because it's ours and because how it's spent is going to have a very direct, very real potential outcome on the American people. We cannot pretend anymore that we have the money to do this, that the economic cost is free, or that the military risk is free. None of them are. Shame on us if we don't turn this around. Shame on us if we pass this tonight. Shame on us if we do this without taking any steps to secure the integrity of our own border. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.